Thursday, Friday, and yesterday would be number 355, 56, and 57, James, and 1st and 2nd Peter. If you had to summarize James, what would it be? What's the idea that seems to predominate?
Practical applications for what God's people ought to be doing.
Okay.
How to live.
How to live. Of course, in one sense, could all the epistles be that way? In one sense, there's something that strikes at the heart of it, I think, in the very introduction. Count it all joy when we fall into manifold trials. And it seems to be that knowing that the proof of your faith works patience, growth comes through trials. That seems to be an idea that dominates through there. Growth comes through hearing, not just hearing only, but hearing and doing, chapter 1. And not being a respecter of what and two persons. Chapter 3, what's the big issue there? How to speak, yeah. Knowing we shall receive the greater condemnation. In 4, there is a tendency to be like the world. Ye adulteresses and adulterers, know ye not that friendship with the world is what? Enmity with God. And failing to put God in our thinking in advance. Come ye that say today, tomorrow, go buy and sell, good day, go into town, buy, sell, get gain. You don't know what is on the morrow, your life is but a vapor. So that you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. And when we don't do that, to him that knows to do good and does it not, to him it's sin. I think some brethren misuse that passage. I think contextually he's talking about failing to put God in the forefront of our mind. Now, certainly, if I know something I need to do is right and good, and I don't do it right then, in some areas it can be sin. But I can think of a bunch of things I need to do that are good things to do, and I don't have time to do them. And if that's the case, then we're always sinning. And I don't believe that's the case. We know to do good, and we need to do as much of it as we can. In 1 Peter, there is a similar idea, I think, of persecution, and it's even emphasized more, I think, in 1 Peter, that glorification, being rewarded eventually, follows what? Suffering. I think that's it. And I believe again in the 1st chapter, he's begot us again into a living hope, verse 3 and verse 4, to an inheritance incorruptible. There's your reward that fades not away, reserved in heaven for you, who by the power of God are guarded through faith of salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time, wherein ye greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you've been what? Put to grief in manifold trials. Yeah, and the trials seem to be persecution, especially in end of 3 and all down really through 4. In fact, 4:12, but beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trials among you, that some strange thing has happened. Just consider it a part of the territory. And then in 2 Peter, there seems to be a little change of pace. There's one idea that dominates that. In fact, I think the last verse is probably the key. Grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Knowledge seems to dominate. We're to add to it in chapter 1. And we're to have it in chapter 2 because there are a number of what that come onto the scene. False teachers. And then even chapter 3, they would say, well, where is the promise of his coming? Well, they willfully forget about the fact that during the flood, God destroyed the world with water, and he's going to destroy it with what? Fire in the hereafter. So that seems to be the idea for 2 Peter. Okay, comment or question? Anybody? All right, let's go back to John 11. And while you're going to John 11, and in our workbook, in the Waldron's stuff as well, let me see, page number 41 is where we are. Let's go back and just kind of make sure we're all on the same page. In the major divisions of Jesus' life, those early chapters deal with the years of what? Preparation. About how many are there? About 30. Until the event that begins the beginning ministry, which was his baptism. 3 to 6 months there in Judea in the beginning ministry, primarily in Judea around Jerusalem. And then John has been in prison. He had been preaching in Enon near Salem, which was up toward Samaria. And so Jesus, when the Pharisees understand Jesus is baptizing more disciples, then there's a need to get out of there. So he goes north, and we have the great Galilean ministry for a better part of 2 years. And then, because they're following him, many of them were following him for the wrong reasons, we have the periods of retirement, about 4. Goes to Caesarea Philippi and makes about 4 distinct excursions through there. And then in Luke 9:51, he sets his face toward Jerusalem. And so we're coming from Galilee on down through Samaria, and then we're in Judea and as well as Samaria for the closing ministry. All right, and that's where we are. Here's the map I've shown you a number of times. Perea and Judea, and here's Jerusalem. John primarily records events in Jerusalem, and Luke in Judea as well as Perea. Now, I emphasize this, doctored this map a little differently. Jesus evidently has been over in Perea. We don't know exactly where, but it seems like it because he says in John 11, which is where we are, that we need to go into Judea, which indicates that he's not there. And so if he's in Perea, it would take roughly a little less than a day to get over to Bethany, which was where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha were, that we'll read about. And then after everything is said and done, and the scribes, the Pharisees get together and they convene as to how we're going to put him to death, then he goes 8 to 12 miles up to Ephraim in the end of John 11. And so that's where we are. Now, this closing ministry, John 7, 8, 9, and 10. Then we went into Luke 10 through 13. Then we went back to John, and because it was the feast, first we had the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall, the Feast of Dedication, which is about right now, around December 22, 23. And then he withdraws at the end of John, he withdraws to Perea, and then we go back to Luke 14, 15, where we were in 16 and the first 10 verses of 17, and then we drop back to John 11 and have the raising of Lazarus. A little later we'll go to Jerusalem. Begins his last journey to Jerusalem, and on the way he will heal 10 lepers. We have the explanation about the nature of the kingdom, a number of other things that follow here. All right, if you would, let's read just a little on page 41 down at the bottom. Jesus raises Lazarus. In Luke 17:11, Jesus begins his last journey toward Jerusalem. Hold your finger there in in John 11, and go back real quickly. I want to notice something with you. This is why the chronology of the things that we're talking about now the chronology is a little bit more difficult to put together. If you go back to John, I told you to go back to John 17. Luke. Go to Luke 9, please. Luke 9. Luke 9 and verse 51. Whoever has that first, read it.
Now it came to pass, when the time had come for him to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem.
All right, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem. But we've got several events that will occur. I want you to note your translations. Do any of your translations, and I believe they will, have a little footnote or superscript around he should be steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem? Do you have some passages in Luke as a footnote or superscript? There you go. What else?
17:11, 18:13,
Yes, and then, yeah, 1911, and then verse 28. Yeah, how many of you have that in your Bibles? I know the New American Standard does, the American Standard does, several do. Just note them real quickly, because this helps us to see that he evidently was going back and forth between Perea, Judea, and toward Jerusalem, then he would get back out. We just read that in 951. Then in 1322, turn over to that real quickly. 1322. He went on his way through cities and villages, teaching and journeying on unto Jerusalem. All right, and then turn over to 17, verse 11, which is where we just finished Wednesday night about the parable of the unjust steward in 16, and then the rich man and Lazarus, and then in 17, the first 10 verses, the unprofitable servant. Verse 11, it came to pass as they were on the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along the borders of Samaria and Galilee. So he's I won't take time to look at the map, but Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. So he's still up there somewhere north in Samaria. What was the next passage? 1831. Let's turn over there. 1831. And he took unto him the 12 and said to them, Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, all things that are written through the prophets. Now, at this point, he's not just going, toward Jerusalem. He is actually going into Jerusalem, and we'll have him in Jericho, and then the rest of Luke has the final week, and then the other passage that Charlie mentioned, 1911, and then 28, wasn't it, Brother Charlie? Though he's already in Jerusalem then. So. But those are the passages that kind of mark he's out in Judea somewhere. He's going that way, and so. But the closing ministry is pointing toward everything winding down. The hostility is doing what? Lessening or growing? Growing. Hostility toward Jesus is growing. When we get to the end of John 11, they're out to kill him. I mean, now the plan is there, and so the farther he goes, the more distinct his teaching is about his death, the more he's teaching the apostles, and the greater the hostility is growing. So several things going on at one shot. Yes, sir.
Don't you get the picture that when he sent out the 70, that was kind of the beginning of his
Beginning of the end.
movement south?
Yes,
And
I think so.
Went through and then came back and reported. And
Yeah.
So they're expecting him to come and teach, and he did.
Yeah.
And it's hard to tell. It looks like to me he was moving north and south a lot, and over
Yes.
Perea, and when he would have a
Yeah.
difficult confrontation, he would go over into Perea.
Yes, or just somewhere away from that general vicinity. I think you're right. The border between Samaria and Galilee, we read about there, right in this vicinity here. So he's away from it, but he's drawing closer, and the hostility is elevated at this point, and so that's just where we are in light of everything that we see. So go back on page 41 of my notes, and under the note there in Luke 17:11, Jesus begins his last journey toward Jerusalem. He travels through Perea and will approach Jerusalem from Jericho. And that's Luke 18. We looked at that a moment ago. When he arrives at Bethany outside Jerusalem, he will remain there for 2 days before entering Jerusalem in the triumphal entry. That's the last week, obviously. At this point, however, the resurrection of Lazarus must have taken place, since there's no time for it afterward. Further, after Lazarus' resurrection, Jesus went into Ephraim for a short time, a village about 8 to 12 miles north of Jerusalem. Likely the chronology is this. Jesus was still in Perea when he learned of Lazarus' illness. Now I've got I don't have it in here, but I probably should put it. If you could look at John 11 and verse 7. What does it say? John 11:7.
Then after this he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again.
Yeah, let us go into Judea again, which means he was evidently out of Judea. And so we assume it was somewhere there in Perea. Back in the note, he traveled to Bethany where Lazarus was buried, raised him from the dead, and left for Ephraim. From there, he must have gone to Galilee briefly, traveled with the multitudes on their way to Jerusalem for the Passover, and they would have come down through Perea, crossed the Jordan at Jericho, and then have come to Jerusalem for the triumphal entry, beginning the last week of his earthly ministry. All right, and then on the next page, you have kind of an overall outline of what happens here in John 11. And I added a little to it here on the chart here. This is the same. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, the events leading to Lazarus' death, the conversations between Jesus and the apostles, then his coming to Bethany and comforting the sisters Mary and Martha. And then he's taken to the cemetery, the tomb where Lazarus was. He raises Lazarus, and then that has an effect. You have believers and then people who are disbelievers. Many believe, some doesn't say they believe, they just went and told the Pharisees about it. And obviously, could that be some kind of a duping of the people, or is the resurrection just undeniable? Which is, could he have duped these people, and Lazarus was just, he'd been in the tomb for 4 days, or what?
He couldn't have done a greater miracle.
No, the resurrection is the miracle of miracles from himself as well as other people. And the very fact that he had been there 4 days indicated he was completely dead. There was no question about him swooning or anything else like some say about Jesus. So many believed, and evidently some believed and told the Pharisees, and their simple reaction was, look at what all he's doing. Here we're sitting back doing nothing. We better do something. And then Caiaphas says, if we don't do anything, the Romans are going to come in here and take our place and our nation. So it's better that one man die than all the nation be. So they convene and begin to plan how to kill Jesus. And then he departs from Ephraim. And then 1155 is another little benchmark. What is it? What day or feast was it? 1155 of John. The Passover. Yeah, and so we come to the Passover. And so, all right, let's look at it now.
Among their planning, they plan to kill the raised Lazarus as well.
Exactly. And yeah, in chapter 12, they won't get rid of the evidence, try to kill Lazarus. He'll die a second time. All right, let's begin reading. And let's just read what probably won't say a whole lot, maybe make a comment here or there. Brother Charlie, if you would, why don't you read down through 8, 1 through 8. May stop you in between, but let's go ahead, 1 through 8.
Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord's ointment and washed his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick.
All right, let's stop there for just a moment. John is writing years and years after these events. And so what he says in verse 2, it was that Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment. John has not recorded that yet. That's going to happen in what? In the next chapter. It's chapter 12. And it will be the last week. And Mary will be there, and she will anoint the Lord with the pure nard, break the alabaster flask, you remember? Judas will object. He'll say, could this not have been sold and given to the poor? And Jesus rebukes Judas, commends Mary, says, let her alone. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body before him. That's what he refers to. And so it's like if we were talking about, you think, well, if you look backward in John, you won't find that. And then sometimes when people say, well, that was in Luke 7 with a sinful woman. No, that's a different one. That's a different occasion. It's earlier and it's a different person. It's kind of like if somebody's writing right now about those of us who know a little bit about Birmingham's history. You remember that early on, it was not called Birmingham. It was called Elaton. And it was based on Elaton Village and the western part, Birmingham, Elaton Land Corporation and so on. And if you were writing about Birmingham and you would say, now, Elaton, which really was the western side of Birmingham, well, it wasn't the western side of Birmingham then, but that's what it became. Likewise, John's writing years back and he's looking, okay, now this Mary is the same one who anointed his, well, not right then, but it's a little bit later. And so he's writing years later about something and then putting something else with it. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, Brother Charlie, go ahead. In verse 3.
So the sister sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, this sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God might be glorified by it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he then stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And after this, he said to his disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and you are going there again?
All right, let's think back in the book of John. When did they take up stones in order to stone him? Back in chapter?
Feast of Dedication.
That's right. Back in just a chapter before, in chapter 10. And so, hey, the last time we were over there, bad things were happening. So let's don't do that. Well, then Jesus responds. Landon, if you would, 9 through 16.
Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover.
All right, stop there real quick. They just think that when he said he's fallen asleep, he's just asleep, and he's sick, and he just fell asleep like we rest, but he's going to be okay. Well, Jesus answers that. Go ahead, Landon.
Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest asleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go. That way we may die with him.
I've heard people, thank you, Landon. I've heard people say, well, look there. Jesus is glad people are dying and cast kind of aspersions on Jesus. He's not glad that Lazarus died, but he's glad for a bigger purpose that could be served, which was that through his resurrection, people would end up what? Believing on him. Exactly right. And notice back up in verse 4. When Jesus heard it, he said, this sickness is not unto death, that is ultimately, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified thereby. So the sickness would lead to his death, but Jesus would raise him up. So ultimately, it was not death. And he was glad that people could, I take it to be, there's other passages that are similar in nature. I'm thinking of Hebrews 12, where he said, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising shame, and sat down on the right hand of the throne of God. Who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising shame. Well, what was the joy that was set before him? That enduring the cross and despising shame, he might bring many sons into glory. And so there's the bigger picture served. I think that is a big, big lesson for us. That in sickness and death, that we see a bigger picture than just what we're experiencing at that time. That we're all going to eventually, likely, get sick, and we're all going to die. And seeing that, it ought to make us do what? What should sickness and death make us do? Just go to the hospital, go to the doctor? Certainly, yeah. We're going to die. And so we are reminded of that so vividly. And instead of getting caught up, we need to ask, kind of like the bowls of wrath that are poured out in Revelation in those mid-chapters, that is the idea of, look, I'm warning you. I'm telling you what's happening in order that you can get yourself right. And so the bigger picture, I think, is what Jesus is saying here, that this is sickness is not to death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified thereby. All right, let's keep reading then. Down in verse 17 through 37, I mentioned 1 through 16 are the events, or compose the events leading to Lazarus' death. And then Jesus waits how many days in Perea? 2 days. So evidently, better part of a day is coming. And so he comes to Bethany. Let's pick up the reading here, 17 through, Cooper, why don't you read 17 through 26. Make it 25, 17 through 25.
So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 15 stadia away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to consult them about their brother. So then Martha, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him. But Mary stayed in the house. Martha then said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here for my brother, he would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give to you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise from the dead. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise from the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even if he dies.
All right. It'd be interesting that Martha, you would have to say, has a considerable amount of faith. True or false? True. In fact, she says the same thing to Jesus that Mary says a little bit later. Lord, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. We've got confidence in you. 2 or 3 things. When Jesus gets there, how long had Lazarus been in the tomb already? 4 days, verse 17. Still an interesting idea here. Bethany was nigh to Jerusalem about, Cooper's translation read 15 stadia. Stadia, wasn't it? Some of your older translations have furlong, and some of the other translations have a little less than what, or about 2 miles. This is an interesting, me. A furlong, a furrow. But the Greek word stadia is about 600. It's roughly, a track around a football field is 1/4 mile. And half of it, 200, is 440 yards, 220. 220 times 3 feet, 220 yards times 3 is 660, right, 660. Well, roughly, the measurements have differed a little bit, but roughly that half of a lap, or 1/8 of a mile, is what a stadia was. And in the Romans, they would just have kind of a big circle, 1/8 of a mile track, basically. I remember when I was in school, we used to run. David, you ride 220s quite a bit. Yeah, I'm not going to ask you what your time.
It wasn't fun.
It was not fun. I'll tell you what, when I was in school, we ran a lot of 220s, because the 220 is not a whole lap. Most of us can't run full speed, can't sprint it. But 220 is almost a dead sprint. And you can do it, but boy, you are huffing and puffing after it's over. But that was uncommon. Well, it so happened that in England, about the general distance that you could plow an ox before you needed to stop, maybe turn and give him a little bit of rest, was about the same length. So you have a little bit over 600 feet. And so that began to be known, that length of a stadia began to be known as a furlong, how long one furrow was. Isn't that neat? And so if you have 15 times 625 feet, you get roughly right at 10,000 feet. So mile is 5,280 feet. Almost 10,000 would make it a little less than what? 2 miles. That's how you get all those. So Bethany, going back to the mount, Bethany is a little less than 2 miles, about 1 mile and 7/8, something like that. John was very precise on all of that, you see. All right, and then notice when verse 19, many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them. And Martha, when she heard Jesus was there, got up, and Mary is doing what? She stays seated in the house and said, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother had not died, Martha says. Even now I know that whatsoever you shall ask of God, he will give you. In other words, she had confidence that he could do what even then? Raise him from the dead. Yeah. And so Jesus said, yeah, he's going to rise again. And Martha, to her credit, says, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Keep your finger there and turn back to chapter 5 real quickly. Chapter 5. Look at verse 28 and 29. Jesus is talking about the fact that he has power to give life. Look at 28 and 29. Kirsten, if you would read that for us.
Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment.
All right. All that are in the tomb shall hear his voice. Now look over in chapter 6. Look at verse 39. Read that, Kirsten. 39.
And this is the will of him who sent me, that I should lose nothing of all that he has given me, but raise it up on the last day.
All right. And then 40.
For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who looks on the Son and believes in him should have eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day.
And one more, 44.
No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day.
All right, so the question is, has Jesus already been teaching about events of the last day? Yes. And obviously, she had heard, she had put it in her mind, and something is going to happen where Jesus is going to raise everybody up at the last day. It's interesting that in chapter 12, we haven't gotten there yet, but in verse 48, he that rejecteth me and receiveth not my sayings hath one that judgeth him. The word that I speak, the same shall what? Judge him in the last day. So not only will people be raised from the dead on the last day, but judgment will occur on the last day. So let's go back to chapter 11 now. Martha understood that. I know that he's going to be raised at the last day sometime in the future. Well, Jesus kind of blends those two ideas together in 25 and 26. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth on me, though he die, yet shall he live. Die how? Physically, spiritually? Evidently what? Physically. Though he die physically, he'll live. Possibly physically resurrected from the grave. You could be spiritually. Though he die spiritually, he's still alive. And whosoever liveth, that is evidently spiritual, and believest on me shall never die spiritually, evidently. Believest thou this? All right, let's keep reading. 27 down through, I'll still go that far to 37. 27 down through 31 here. Kylie, if you would, 27 through 31.
She said to him, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. And when she had said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary, her sister, saying, The teacher has come and is calling for you. As soon as she heard that, she rose quickly and came to him. Now that Jesus had not yet come into town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews were with her in the house and comforting her. When they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out following her, saying, She is going to the tomb.
All right, so she says, yes, I believe everything you're saying, back in verse 27. And so after she says that, she goes and gets who? Mary. And she says, the teacher is here. That's all she had to say. So Mary jumps up and begins to go, and those who are with her, they think, well, she's going to the tomb to weep, so we will go with her. So she comes to Jesus, and let's pick up in 32 through 37 here, Patty, if you would.
Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
Now, let me stop you real quick. The same language to the T of what Martha had said earlier. Both of them say the same thing, okay?
Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, See how he loved him. And some of them said, Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying?
All right. Now read down through, I'm sorry I stopped you there. Read down through the next verse, 38.
Then Jesus again, groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it.
All right, so Mary comes to him, and immediately she falls down at his feet. Yeah. It's an interesting idea, and I've got this on the note on a chart a little bit later, that every time we see Mary and Jesus, she is at his feet. Here in chapter 12, she's going to anoint his feet with this pure nard and wipe his feet with her hair. And then in Luke 10, when Jesus comes to Bethany and they've made a feast there, she is sitting there listening while Martha is, scurrying about taking care of the supper. So she's always right there at the feet. I was telling Landon earlier, I knew because I had our hymns for worship at home, but it's not in this book, and it's not in Songs of the Church, but it's in Sacred Selections. Some of you a little older will remember sitting at the feet of Jesus, watching, waiting every day, trusting in his grace and power, safe to keep me all the way. Sitting at the feet of Jesus, where I love to kneel and pray, till his goodness and his glory drive the shadows from my way. I wish we could sing that. We could, but not right now. But it's not in our books, so we'd have to copy it. Great song, and that's the picture we have of Mary when she comes to Jesus. All right, so another quick thing, and I mentioned this on the slide, 2 or 3 things. In verse 33, when Jesus sees her weeping and the Jews weeping who came with her, he groaned in the spirit. Down in verse 38, Jesus therefore again groaning in himself. That's his, I take that to be his human spirit. Some have asked me, did Jesus have a spirit? And people understand, well, the Holy Spirit guided him, but I take it that he had that the spirit of Jesus was what we consider is what you are, not your body, but your spirit. He had that as well as, and we really know that from other passages. His flesh would not dwell in the grave, nor his spirit in Sheol. Yeah. So, or Hades. So you've got the two combined parts of Jesus. He groaned in his spirit, and then he groaned in himself, like and I've got that in a note, but kind of a combination of indignation, sadness, emotions just kind of coming out. Oh, this is so terrible, and this is what sin has done, and these are these people I love. That's another thing I didn't bring to your attention earlier. You may have already seen it. It's interesting, back in verse 3, the sisters sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. That's an interesting, that's phileo, fondness, warmth, one you have an attachment to. And then a little later, when it says, when John just says he loved them, it's agapao. It's the selflessness. And then back again over here, They could see how he loved him, verse 36. It goes back to Philip. They could see the fondness, the attachment Jesus had. You have both words used there. All right, let's move on. 38, we've already read 38. 39 through 44. We'll end up this section where Jesus actually raises Lazarus from the dead. David, if you would.
Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of him who is dead, said to him, "Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" When they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me, and I know that you always hear me. For because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me." Now when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Loose him and let him go."
All right. Martha objects, why are you removing the stone from the tomb? It's going to be a bad smell to it. And Jesus said, didn't I tell you, if you believe, you would see the glory of God? And so they remove the stone, and then he has a brief prayer to the Father. And in essence, he says, I thank you that you've heard me in times past. That's a great principle for us. When we're praying, I'm thankful for your answered prayers in times past. And he says, verse 42, I knew that thou hearest me always. I know that present tense. You've heard me in times past. You hear me now. And I'm asking you to grant this request that they may believe. Here's the reason, that thou didst send me. And so when he had thus spoken in this prayer, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. It wasn't that, it was just by the sound of his voice, but the Jews would know that all Jesus had to do was recognize this is what I want to do, and what would happen? It would occur. Just speak and it would occur. And so everyone could hear that. Lazarus comes out with these grave clothes, the linen, the napkin over his face. I just picture him as he's still kind of wound, and maybe just walking like kind of something like this. He can't get a full. And Jesus says, loose him, let him go. Undo these grave clothes. He's alive. He's alive. So then, oh boy, I was afraid our time was going to catch us, even going fairly quickly. What's the reaction in 45 and 6? Many therefore did what? Believed on him. But some, there's your contrast, went away to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. In 47 through 53, they convened, and look at the language there, middle of 47. What do we? What in the world are we? We're not doing anything. For this man doeth many signs. We're not doing anything, and he's doing a lot. Many signs. Here are his enemies. Huge admission. He is doing a lot of miracles. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him. The Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation, our position. They got the point, didn't they? We've been pointing out all through the life of Christ that the reason these scribes and Pharisees couldn't stand Jesus is because if what he said was right, then the church was in the coming, and there would be no what? Would there be a need for these positions any longer? No. Chief priest, well, all Christians are priests. Jesus is our high priest. There's no need for the temple. In fact, Jesus said that in John 4. The hour comes when they won't come to Jerusalem. God is a spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. And so the place would be insignificant. All of those things that they gloried in would be no more need. And they would have been fulfilled in Christ. But a certain one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said, you don't know anything, nor do you take account that it's expedient for you that one should die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish. Now this he said not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for the nation. Well, he thought if we put Jesus to death, he'll just get rid of our problem. Our nation will be okay. But it had a really, he didn't realize what he was saying. That actually with the death of Jesus, it would provide salvation for them as well as for the nation. And not for the nation only, but that he might also gather together into one the children of God that are scattered abroad. So from that day forth, they took counsel that they might put him to death. Okay, we're going to have to stop. I hate it. But there are a lot of lessons. Lord willing, we'll go through that on Wednesday night and answer our questions. How many, let's see, this is how many, second, third, or fourth resurrection that Jesus has accomplished that we have recorded? The third. The first was Jairus' daughter. Second was the widow of Nain's son, and now Lazarus. And you think, and I've got this, so the first one was evidently immediately after she died. The widow of Nain's, as he was being carried